Welcome to Superhero Spectating with Harold and Hassan. We're a fan based podcast with two non experts exploring superhero. As always, we're happy to have you along for some theories and fun. Welcome to the episode. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Welcome back to another episode of Superhero Spectating. We are going to, as expected, review Morbius now that two out of the three of us have seen the movie. Those two being myself and our special guest, Tim. Tim, say hi to the listeners.
Hello, listeners. My name's Tim. Is this a good time for the introduction?
Yeah. I was just going to say, Tim's an old friend of mine and a new friend of Harold and a fan of the podcast. And I wanted to give you, Tim, an opportunity to share who you are, any fun facts you'd like to share. If you're working on anything and you want to mention that, feel free to throw that in. Any shameless plugs, I would do it. And then tell us about your favorite superheroes and why you were interested in joining in on this episode, I guess.
Alrighty. Well, as I was telling Harold, like many people, my first exposure to comics was Spider-Man, reading him growing up. And interestingly enough, the only other comic that I picked up was Moon Knight. So Spider-Man and Moon Knight were my only exposure to actually reading comics growing up, which I know is an unusual combination, but Spider-Man, yeah, he's been a favorite of mine ever since because of that. And my favorite comic character ever is Taskmaster. I'm a fan of literature, classic literatures, and I was interested in joining this episode particularly because of Morbius, as I'm a big fan of vampires and vampire mythos, and I've been excited for a while to see how that sort of side of the comics was going to be introduced into the cinematic universe. So, and also the first episode of Moon Knight dropped, and that's been exciting for me as well. And that's something I would also be interested in discussing and hearing other people's thoughts about.
All right. Well, that sounds like a solid segue into our reviews. Harold, did you have anything that you wanted to share with the fans before we jump into them?
I just wanted to share that I am the one of us that did not watch Morbius. I haven't watched the actual ending credit clips, but I've watched videos breaking them down. So I do know what happens at the end. And I look forward to asking you guys questions about the movie, considering that you guys have seen it.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to jump into our non-spoiler free discussion on Morbius, the recent Sony Marvel movie that came out this week.
So yeah, I guess I'd like to start the conversation by asking you guys, what are your initial thoughts on the movie? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Did it live up to your expectation?
Unfortunately, not. I think I go into most movies, and if you've been listening to the podcast, you've probably gotten this vibe. I go into most movies thinking that there's going to be something that sticks out that makes it an exceptional storytelling opportunity. And I know that a lot of the people in the creative process go ahead and put their heart and their soul into making a movie, and they're fans of the content that they're creating on screen for us. And there were parts of the movie that I can appreciate, but I think that in general, and this may have been because of the delays or the pandemic, but I think that the movie was a poorly told story of Morbius. And for him being an obscure character, it seemed like a missed opportunity for me. I think it was poor execution, which is why I threw it into tier 3. And just in case you guys aren't familiar with tier 3 or don't remember our description of it, I just wanted to go back over it. Tier 3 is what we call a popcorn movie. It's either fun or watchable, not edge of your seat entertainment, or it can be defined as bearable and a poorly executed film. And I wanted to use that description to jump into some likes and dislikes about Morbius. I personally thought that the first half had a healthy pace, decent exposition, and decent build up, and I even liked the way that they introduced the character's love interest and the duality of his humanity and his moral compass. I think I've read some reviews online that kind of stated, it was very early 2000s and spot on with how they handled it, but I still thought that it was nicely done. And in my theater, unlike some of the reviews that I'm reading, there were only about 12 people, if that much, sitting there. And when opportunities for jokes came up, and you could tell that they tried to be funny, but when opportunities for jokes came up, no one laughed. I laughed. I thought some of the jokes were decent and worth a chuckle, but it was awkward. You know, they made some references to the Hulk and other characters in the universe. They had some 80s moments with the dancing, and it took you out a bit, but you saw what they were trying to do. And with that said, I think that the tone was pretty consistent. I just think that it wasn't exactly what they expected it to be. The action scenes were, for me, too dark, and the way that they illustrated his abilities clashed with the background of the movie, or the several backgrounds of the movies, especially when he was fighting, because they would have to go into a freeze frame to actually show the very few hand-to-hand combat opportunities. And I think I can say that and still acknowledge him showcasing his abilities early on in the movie, or about halfway through the first act. That was actually cool. It was nice to see it. But the last ability that they tease in his relationship with Bats in the movie leads into what would be the poorly executed resolve, or denouement, of the third act. The CGI wasn't what you would expect from a late 2000s superhero movie. Wasn't always decent, but it is at best the quality of a Marvel zombie, I'd say. The second act made the pace slower, and the third act was wild. There was a moment between the main character and his love interest that was borderline inappropriate to throw into the movie, but it was funny to watch and also cringy. It's like, did they really do that? And the way that they use that character to build up towards a sequel after the final fight, which again was handled very poorly, and we'll get into it later, at least in my opinion. The final fight and the cue for a sequel are what really took it away from me, from it being a good movie and made it tier 3. If that third act didn't happen the way that it did, I might have said it was low tier 2 if people in the audience actually laughed. Something that I do want to mention before I cut myself off, because I've been talking for a while and I want to give Tim an opportunity, is I wanted to say that the mention of the Daily Bugle and the newspaper references were cool, but I didn't, I'm sorry, fans, have an opportunity to read close enough to see which Daily Bugle it was, although Daniel Espinosa has stated that we can expect sometime soon to get confirmation as to which Spider-Man is going to be in the universe, and I partly think we're going to get that in Doctor Strange, which comes out next month. Tim, after you share your thoughts on the movie, maybe we can get into how they handled the development of the Sinister Six, since you, Harold, and I have all either seen a breakdown of those credits or have seen the credits ourselves. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of the points you had on the movie. I think I had a more enjoyable time with it than the majority of audiences will have. Um, I I don't have a lot of knowledge about vampires in the Marvel universe or the I haven't read any of the Morbius comics, aside from a couple brief times when he's appeared in Spider-Man stories. But as a fan of vampires, at large, I thought Morbius was a fun time. I was a fan of the way that his powers were represented, um, and vampire media is always a tricky thing because it's always a question of, do they want to do their own thing, their own story with the mythology of being a vampire,
Mm-hmm.
or do they want to sort of emulate the Dracula character or the Dracula story, since that's the most famous vampire tale? And
Right.
Morbius has always been, he's not a Dracula character, right? He's more like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of character.
Oh, that's
Similar
fair.
to, yeah, similar to a lot of Spider-Man villains, like the Lizard or Dr. Octopus in the Sam Raimi movies.
Yeah.
And I think that this film did a pretty good job of, I don't know, I felt it did a decent job of characterizing Jared Leto's Michael Morbius, or making him a protagonist that you could follow and root for, to get through the trials that the movie was putting in front of him.
Got it. Okay.
Um,
Okay.
Let me think. I think the movie had a lot of cliches, um, that sort of uh, didn't work to its benefit, and some parts were sort of sloppily executed. I think the villain was kind of a miss. Despite, I think the actor gave a good performance and did everything he could with the script that he was given.
Yeah, I agree with that. He committed.
Yeah, I think
He
the acting
committed.
all around was pretty good in that movie. Jared Leto can be a little wooden sometimes in other movies in his career, but I think he did a pretty good job with this one. Um, I agree with you. I think the ending was a little. I thought the ending after the final fight was very abrupt. Like, I thought that they were
Mm-hmm.
building up for like a final scene or a couple final scenes after the final confrontation, but instead it just ended immediately. I was sort of thinking, well, it seems like they were going to do more, but then they just stopped. So I don't know. I thought that was a little bit of a disappointment.
Fair. Okay.
I'm curious. You mentioned a scene between Morbius and his love interest that you thought was inappropriate. Is that something you can talk about here on the show, or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're family friendly. I'm not gonna say anything explicit, right? But
Right.
I think that what took my fiance and out of that last moment is that we knew there was gonna be some misattribution of arousal, and that they were going to, when he of course didn't have the time to kiss one another. And I was confused about who bit whose lip, but it seems like he accidentally bit his lip when he was kissing her before she allegedly died.
Mm.
And in biting his lip and his blood pouring into her mouth, when it touched her bottom lip, she licked her lip in what seemed to be a sensual way. And I thought, this is comedy. There's no, and there was an 11-year-old, maybe a 9-year-old, sitting like 14 seats to our left. And I was thinking to myself, what? Why would they throw that in? It was so unnecessary. And it was funny, but it seemed it seemed very sensual. So I didn't expect to see it in a movie. But they
Mm.
also did the classic superhero body shot and showcased Jared Leto's body. And, for a 50-year-old
Oh,
man, looking good.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's interesting. The way I interpreted that moment when I saw it, I didn't think of it in that way. I interpreted it as she bit his lip, and she intentionally licked up the blood in that way because she was trying to non-verbally convey to him, "You need to drink my blood in order to, save the day or whatever."
And he did.
And he did. But that's interesting that you say that because there's always been sort of a sensual undertone within around vampires. I shouldn't say always. Ever since Dracula came out, there's always been that that theme of sexuality with their their mythology, I guess.
Yeah, Nosferatu, Twilight.
Yeah, Bram Stoker. He lived in the Victorian era where morals, particularly surrounding sexuality, were very rigid, very strict. And so the reason that his novel Dracula was horror in that time was that it was sort of like the reason the vampires, particularly Dracula's brides in that novel, are sort of very seductive and very sensual is because they kind of represented the repressed sensual instincts that humans had, especially repressed in the time that Bram Stoker lived. So they were like extremely taboo, which is sort of fed into the horror. Similar to why The Exorcist was such a smash hit when it came out, is it's very explicit depictions of like defacement of Christian iconography. People just didn't make movies like that at that time, like that was horrific imagery to see. Anyway.
No, I think that's an interesting thought because I don't know if you two remember this scene from Spider-Man 3, but it's another Sony movie, another Sony slash Marvel inspired movie. And there's this aggressively suggestive scene, depending on how you're looking at the shadows in the room and the shapes that go into the shot. But when the symbiote overcomes Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, Tobey's in bed and the shadow of the symbiote's hand creeps over his bed and latches onto him while he's asleep and then overcomes him subconsciously. And I think it's a very graphic or horrific level of an intimate attachment, and maybe the director was trying to kind of film a moment where it realized that humanity was succumbing to something else and suggest that it's not necessarily ethical or not clearly right, or it's uncomfortable, just like the scene where the symbiote, without Peter's consent, takes over his body. And maybe they were trying to be more direct in the Morbius scene about his female partner consenting to him biting her so that he could have the energy and the power he would need in her, like giving herself to him for him to be physically prepared for that final battle, since his counterpart Lucian he'd been killing people left and right and taking their blood. And then my partner pointed out to me she was the only character whose blood was not drained in the movie. She was just bitten into, which actually made more sense of why she would have been transformed versus having died. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting take. But the moment happened so fast that I didn't see that detail, so I wouldn't have thought about it. But I think, yeah, between you and I having different takes on the moment, they definitely could have done it in a more direct way, but maybe they wanted it to be implied. And to your defense and listening to what you've shared, I'm thinking maybe they explored Morbius as a human well, but maybe they didn't do Dr. Michael Morbius as a vampire as well, or at least close his arc as well. And I feel like that's a problem whenever you have a superhero or anti-hero movie where there's a duality. We, as fans, collectively were interested in how Sony was going to handle Venom, and Venom being a villain or an anti-hero or an anti-villain, and how they were going to handle the duality of him and Eddie Brock. But they've done a decent job with that so far. So maybe it's just a direction that Sony wants to take. But did you feel like there was a gap in between the Morbius we saw in the third act, who was willing to kill himself by sunrise, and then the Morbius that we saw meet the Vulture in the ending credit scenes?
May I tag in before that thought? I'm sorry to cut you off, Tim.
No, of course.
I just wanted to, because you guys, I haven't seen the movie, but both your perspectives on that scene that you both described, it opened my mind, and I was just like, I never even thought about like the connection between like sex and vampire culture. And it got me thinking of like other like vampire mediums that I've seen, and yeah, I totally see the connection, even down to like where a vampire like takes a bite. It's like most cliche spot is the neck, and that could be like a very intimate spot, but it's also a very vulnerable spot because it's a spot where you can easily die from it if also like harmed, you know, if not handled appropriately. So it's like, yeah, I thought that was an interesting perspective, and you guys have both opened my mind now to how I view like vampire culture a little bit. Like I never even thought about it on that level, and it's cool. It's cool.
Yeah, and on a separate note, before we jump more into Morbius, I think it's also interesting to see how they handle that with a character like Blade, because I think that Blade's character, and at least in the early 2000s, it was a very interesting approach to have, you know, raves in the background, with raves having their own meaning and how they're received for release, and then the music choice, and then having another vampire be the centerpiece and have his own romantic relations. But then also, like early 2000s, there was still a maybe particular view of African American males, and for them to pick an African American male who could have already been hypersexualized and then make him a vampire and throw him in that context, I think that's a very interesting choice. And I want to go back and rewatch it before we see, is it Mahershala Ali's family-friendly take on another vampire. And I think there's a lot of lore to explore here. I'm very interested in continuing the conversation, but are you guys okay with pivoting back into Morbius and the development of his future arcs?
Yeah, sounds good to me. One quick thing in response to what Harold said. First off, I'm glad to hear that that it introduced a new perspective for you, Harold. But I think there was a quote by Sir Christopher Lee, who a lot of people know from the Star Wars prequels for portraying Count Dooku, or the Lord of the Rings movies for portraying Saruman, who also portrayed Count Dracula in several films. But I think he was quoted sort of his commentary on the sexual or sensual aspect of Dracula and vampires in general was that, you know, what could be more intimate than literally drinking another person's blood. And, it's kind of horrific and very taboo, but it definitely has that intimate nature, which is sort of the center point of the horror around Bram Stoker's character.
Tim, your takes have been so informative. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on this episode, man. Like, you're opening your mind to like so many new things. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, guys.
All right, we're gonna take for another break right now. So we're back from our break, and we want to take an opportunity to discuss the ending credit scenes of Morbius. I shared my suspicions in the last episode, which our co-host Harold was there for, and Tim has had an opportunity to listen to, and it doesn't seem like we nor anyone else had read a leak was that far off. We did in fact see Adrian Toomes from Spider-Man Homecoming, the first movie of Spider-Man's trilogy in the MCU, transported through what was notably seen as the last and quote-unquote successful spell of Doctor Strange in Spider-Man No Way Home, and in him being transported to a cell in the Sony universe that Morbius is canon in. It was suggested that he couldn't be detained or incarcerated there because they had no record of any crimes that he committed. So he goes out to live in this universe, which he's still getting to know, and it's assumed that some time has passed by based on the start of the conversation that he and Morbius, which did not kill himself, had in the desert, and what I assume is his friend's Lucian's car. Also very sad because you just killed your best friend and then you took his car, and I'm assuming you're there's a lot there, but to jump back into the critique, I think what was interesting is that they made sense of characters like Adrian Toomes being in the universe, and some people were talking about how it doesn't make sense that he would have a gripe with Spider-Man, and I don't know that that's necessarily true. I sat down with the information more and I thought about it, and he has a gripe with both Spider-Man and Peter Parker, in this instance, Tom Holland's. He may not remember who Tom Holland is, but for anyone that was in jail or watching TV or any of the events that transpired in Spider-Man No Way Home, they would still have memory of Spider-Man themselves. So if he regards Spider-Man as the man who put him in jail for the 8 years that he's been there, or let's say 3, since he probably spent 5 years of those in the blip, then if he was watching TV or looking at J. Jonah Jameson excite any resentment that he might have had for the character, it makes sense that if he was transported to a new universe, he's got to think, oh, it has something to do with the events that Spider-Man was publicly displayed in, 8 seconds before I was transported to this world, and that's the only grounds that he has. But if there's a Daily Bugle there, and if he's been keeping an eye on Morbius, who was also mentioned in the newspapers in the Daily Bugle, then it makes sense that he would think there are some constants across all those universes. That said, I don't quite think that his motivation is strong enough to hold up against him fighting against another Spider-Man, unless he thinks that Spider-Man can bring him home. And I don't think that it makes any sense at all for Morbius, who is introduced as a hero slash anti-hero in his own movie, to then just think, oh yeah, I'm intrigued by you saying that you and I should join up to potentially challenge threats like Spider-Man, if not anything else down the line. So if this is going to be the development of the Sinister Six in this universe that maybe Andrew's a part of, or maybe another Spider-Man's a part of. Maybe it's Spider-Woman, and we'll get more on that once we see Madam Web. I don't know. I just think that it's a poorly executed start to the development of their universe. And even when we saw the Avengers being developed and we saw Tony approach the general to call off his hunt of the Hulk, I just feel like the model that Sony had, which was Marvel, handled it better. Tim, Harold, what are your thoughts on what you've seen from the ending credit scenes?
Tim, you go ahead.
All right. Well, looking at the end credit scenes with the context of, knowing that they're trying to establish a Sinister Six team up, essentially, I think that they did a poor job of characterizing Michael Morbius's motivations to be a villainous character, because pretty much the entire movie he was portrayed in a fairly heroic light.
Right.
Even the worst thing he does in the movie is when he's not in control of his own body. And they only really show him when he is in his right mind as being a fairly moral man who, isn't above breaking the law and isn't above, kind of disrespecting big institutions like turning down the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
But he's shown to be, a more heroic person than a villainous person.
Right.
And so I'm a little bit confused as to how they're going to, if they're intending to make him part of a team of villains, then I'm a bit confused, because they definitely didn't seem to be characterizing him that way.
Yeah, they've only got like one villain on the team of maybe three in the Sinister Six, because Daniel Espinosa has confirmed that Morbius lives within the same universe as Venom, and now we also have Black Cat through mention of Morbius's movie, and Rhino that exists within this universe, and Vulture. So there's some familiar variations of the Sinister Six or Sinister 600, but it just doesn't make sense. Like, even if you throw a Craven in there, they're getting closer to a full roster, but is Craven going to be a villain, or are they going to try and humanize him the same way that they did Morbius and Venom? And then you just have a team of like anti superheroes. And does the Vulture then become, I don't know, like a reformed villain, kind of like all the villains at the end of No Way Home?
Yeah, and I can plausibly see the Vulture from Homecoming being a reformed man, because he never seemed like an evil person necessarily. He was just down on his luck and embittered and willing to do some shady things to
provide for his family.
To take care of the people he cared about.
Yeah.
So he didn't seem like an evil man necessarily, and I would buy if they did go the reformed route with him.
Yeah.
But that leaves me to wonder, what are they going to do with a team of anti-heroes?
Right. Almost is going to be like Buddy Cop, Andrew Garfield, Spider-Man teaming up with his rogues to fight greater villains like the Knoll. We'll get into that in another episode, but yeah.
I think it's a bit of a shame, because I think Carnage would have been the perfect choice for a villain who people need to team up to defeat him.
Yeah,
because that's what he was in the comics. Venom and Spider-Man, their first team up together was because Carnage was too great a threat for either of them to take on alone.
Well, we still have Anti-Venom, so maybe they'll use Anti-Venom instead of Carnage.
Yeah, maybe. It is a shame though, because I think they've sort of already shown their hand with Carnage in Venom 2, but
right. And Harold, your thoughts?
Well, listening to both of you guys, it became more obvious to me, like, two of the problems that I have with one making a
anti-hero movie and expecting that anti-hero to eventually be a Spider-Man villain, because I had the same problem with Venom. I'm like, what conflict would this Venom have with Spider-Man where they would feel the need to be against each other?
Right.
And the second problem is that Sony and Marvel just haven't made the best Spider-Man villains, and to me, it becomes even more obvious with a movie like No Way Home. Like, you have to tell a story bringing other Spider-Man villains. That shows me kind of a lack of being able to create a quality villain for this hero. Like,
that's interesting, because Spider-Man has such a wide roster of villains, and even with the ones that they're thinking about bringing in the show.
I love the Vulture, and I loved his performance. I love Michael Keaton, but he does leave me also feeling like he could be reformed. And some of the best villains are the villains that can't be reformed, because they're a villain. Some people are just evil at heart, like a character like Joker. I get not everybody can be the Joker. You do have to have that balance of reformed villains to show that even villains can grow. Right. But at least when you initially have these villains, I feel, especially with a character like Venom, I'm all like, it would have worked better if he was a Spider-Man villain before he became this anti-hero, because it takes away from the dynamic and the chemistry that Spider-Man can have with his villains,
Yeah, I can see that. I'm hopeful for how they're going to use the Chameleon and Kraven and, oh my god, what is the gentleman from the video game, the Spider-Man video game that was used in the Sinister Six?
Mr. Negative?
Yeah, Mr. Negative. There's a rumor that Mr. Negative might be the next Spider-Man villain. I don't know. I feel like now that he's had a mix of superpowered and non-superpowered villains, some that are menaces like Green Goblin, and that he feels can't be saved, and then a team of them that he ends up trying to save, there is an opportunity for them to get better at how they develop his antagonist. But Harry Osborn, one of his best friends in the comics, is also one of his villains, and he may not be as menacing as the Green Goblin, but I think it's even more personal when they start off as someone you can trust, like Dr. Octopus, and then they become a threat to you, willing to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I think when you're setting up obscure characters and you're trying to give every villain their own movie, since Sony is now Sony's universe of Marvel villains and like Spider-Man characters, you've got to make sure that these movies that are coming out are at least second tier and not a waste, because then as a franchise or as a studio, you might be a little reluctant to throw them into another project because you're not sure how that's going to affect your sales. And at the end of the day, it's still a business. As excited as I am to see certain characters brought to light, I feel like they have to do them justice enough so that we want to go and buy tickets to another movie. And I think the only thing keeping me going into buying tickets to another movie for Morbius right now is seeing how they're going to use Blade, how they might use the Spider-Virus Island and other characters, and what they might do with the Sinister Six and who his Spider-Man's actually going to be. But Marvel, on the other hand, has done a good job of setting up obscure characters in a greater world that happen to, in the comics and shows, have a relationship with Spider-Man. Enter Moon Knight. I do appreciate your feedback. I appreciate your thoughts, and I'm happy to have had you here on the episode. Did you have anything that you wanted to share with the listeners before you jump off? Because we do know that you have obligations that we want to give you an opportunity to tend to.
Oh, well, thank you guys a lot for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My internet just had one of its blips, but do I sound okay?
Yeah, you sound solid now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't have much to say as an outro. Just thank you guys again for having me, and I hope that people enjoyed what input I was able to have.
For sure.
Yeah, I'd like to say thanks for being here. And we appreciate your input. As I said, you gave me more insight and more knowledge about vampire lore that I didn't know before this. So I really appreciate you being on our show. I'd be happy to have you on the show again.
Yeah, man.
Awesome. I'm happy to hear that.
It's always a pleasure.